Good afternoon in New York, good afternoon in Africa, Europe, and Israel, and welcome whatever time of day or night it is for those who are joining us from the rest of the world. I'm Yael Danieli, founder and executive director of the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, ICMGLT for short. Thank you for joining us today. This International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma webinar is held as a belated observance of Yom HaShoah, or Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day, that took place on 28 April this year. Most of, if not all of you, have watched the film Kaddish in advance of this webinar. You then know that Kaddish is a documentary about growing up as a child of a Holocaust survivor. Father Zoltan Klein survived the Holocaust while his parents perished in Auschwitz. The stories of his survival and of his parents' murder became his children's bedtime stories. Kaddish is a film about the psychological ramifications of history, what is called psychohistory. Laced with humor and tenderness, it is a story of a stormy yet loving relationship between Zoltan and his Jewish writer and activist son, Yossi Klein Halevi. Originally premiered at Lincoln Center's New Directors, New Films in 1984, Kaddish won a special jury award at Sundance and was named one of the 10 best films of 1985 by David Edelstein in The Village Voice. The film's 4K restoration had its world premiere at the 2022 New York Jewish Film Festival. The webinar will be a 40-year-later dialogue among the filmmaker, the protagonist, and the Chief Humanities Adviser to the film, who is also the webinar's moderator. Your moderator, that's me, is a clinical psychologist, victimologist, traumatologist, and psychohistorian who has devoted much of her career to studying, treating, and preventing multi-generational impacts of massive trauma, to victims' rights, and to reparative justice. Our first presenter, child of survivors Steve Brandt, the filmmaker, is an Emmy Award-winning film and television producer. He has written and produced for ABC News 2020, now on PBS and Religion and Ethics News Weekly. He produced the documentary A Search for Solid Ground about the first Intifada for PBS. Steve's independent work has been shown in theaters throughout the United States and abroad. He's currently working on a documentary features about religious thinker and human rights activist Abraham Joshua Heschel. Steve is married to journalist Nancy Ramsey and is the father of 2 sons, Lee and Caleb. Our second speaker, the protagonist, Yossi Klein Halevi, is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he co-directs the Muslim Leadership Initiative. His 2018 book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, was a New York Times bestseller. His 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. Yossi is a prolific, thoughtful, empathic, and much in demand thinker and speaker across North America with a devoted Twitter following. He moved to Israel with his wife, Sarah, in 1982. They have 3 children. We have about an hour and a quarter for the webinar. I promised Yossi that we stop at 2:15, or at least that he would leave at 2:15. Each speaker will speak for about 12 minutes. Following an interchange among us, I will open the floor to questions or brief comments from the virtual audience. Panelists will then conclude with last words. Please start thinking. Please use the chat function and we will do our best to respond to as many as we can. Feel free to direct your question to a particular panelist or to the full panel. I give the screen floor to Steve Brandt. Dear Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Yael. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the film and its ongoing relevance today. I really don't have much in the way of an introduction. I think why don't we just get into the conversation, I think would be the most useful thing.
Yeah, I feel that way too. Why don't we just start talking?
That's just fine, because that's how we began over 45 years ago, actually.
Yes.
And we had no trouble starting then. Well, the audience, though, might want to know, how did it happen that you decided to make this film? How did you meet each other? How did it, how did it happen?
Yossi, you want to intro this?
Well, we met, I think it was around 1976, Steve, is that right? And we met at a conference in an organization that no longer exists. It was the Martin Steinberg Center for the Jewish Arts, and it was housed in the American Jewish Congress, which barely exists today. I think they're trying to make some kind of a comeback. And Steve and I met because we were both there handing out proposals for a film on survivors. Now, in 1976,
two separate films.
Totally different films. And I at the time had a friend of mine. We were 2 young writers, Bob Rosenberg, both of us sons of survivors. And we had this idea of making a film about our families, which at the time seemed like a novel idea. Today, of course, there are so many films about the survivor experience, as there is so much literature. In those years, there was basically one book that was out. That was Helen Epstein's groundbreaking book on children of the Holocaust. And as far as I can remember, there were no films about children of survivors. I think there were some that were in the works around the time that we were trying to get our films going. And I don't remember what my proposal was, and I don't remember what Steve's proposal was, but whatever it was, it's not the film that was actually made.
We kind of a strange combination, you know, because your proposal was more focused on children of survivors. My proposal was focused on survivors, the survival experience, being transplanted from an environment that you have to get out of because everybody hates you and is persecuting you, escaping, coming, in this case, to America and starting all over again, new lives, if you will. And for me, my interest was about the resilience of survivors and the historic resilience of the Jewish people to transplant and transform ourselves and yet somehow keep this identity going. And nobody was interested in either of our proposals at this conference, except us. So we decided to work together.
You happen to have the proposals?
I couldn't find yours.
In those filing cabinets?
I still have mine.
You
I
do?
wish I must, it's probably somewhere in the wrong folder somewhere, you know?
And Yossi is lost? I'm sure it's somewhere.
Yeah, really.
Somewhere. I'll dig some more if I can find it.
I think what's, Yael, what's so, I think, touching for me, thinking back 45 years, almost 50 years.
Yeah.
To these two young people. I mean, Steve was an aspiring filmmaker. You were recently out of NYU Film School, I think, right?
I was more than aspiring. I had become a filmmaker.
You had aspired. You were already aspired. Well, I would definitely characterize myself then as an aspiring writer, and I
don't know. You've been writing already for 10 years or so at the time.
Right.
Yeah, but I was, but it was. I remember my father said to me, "Why can't you write as a hobby?" Why?
That's what my parents said to me about filmmaking.
So there's something in this meeting of two very driven young people.
Yes.
Who had a vision that was actually in some ways fulfilled, but very different. The film that came out was very different than either of us conceived of. And yet we really managed. I'd like to, could I just tell one story about Jerry Hochbaum, Alava Shalom, the late Jerry Hochbaum.
Sure.
And Steve, you remember we went to him. He was one of the people we went to see to try. He was at the time, well, for many years, the head of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. And we went to see him with our woefully inadequate proposals. And he read the proposals and he says to us, he said, "I'm not giving you money for this, but I know that the two of you are going to succeed." And
I don't remember that, but I believe it.
and the truth is, later on, he did give us money. And I remember listening to him thinking, well, good news, bad news. And thinking, well, if this guy thinks that we're going to succeed, maybe we will. And it was a real shot in the arm, for me at least.
And basically what happened was the three of us, Bob, Yossi, and I, were having these brainstorming sessions in Yossi's basement in Borough Park and other places as well to discuss what's the film going to be, what's it going to be like. And we learned that the National Endowment for the Humanities was offering youth grants, $10,000. So we said, well, what can let's write a proposal. So we decided to write a proposal about our three families. And we submitted it and we got the grant. It was the first grant proposal that we wrote and we got the grant.
Do you remember how much it was, Steve?
$10,000.
$10,000.
Wasn't bad. We were in a small film, And so we were going to, the thing is though that we'd already started videotaping with some families, but I hadn't told my parents. And once we got the grant, Bob's family decided it was maybe too painful. They didn't want to do it. So I always felt I wanted Yossi's family to be part of it. And certainly Yossi did. And so we were searching for two other families. And then, as fate would had it, after we had started filming for about 6 months, filming with Yossi's family, filming with some other families, going to Soviet Jewry demonstrations, Israel Day parades, talking to survivors in the streets of Manhattan. Then Yossi's father passed away very unexpectedly. He was only 59 years old in Israel. And that changed everything. And at that point, we had to change hats a bit in the production. And I felt that it would be a little too much for Yossi to be making the film with me and Bob at the same time as he was recovering from the loss of his father, taking over the family business. And so I asked him if he was willing to trust me to do it. And you did, which was amazing. And
it's a good decision.
And so Yossi became the subject and his family. And his family was so generous in giving us time and letting us be flies on the walls, following them around. It was really amazing.
You know, when I think back to my mother, who in some ways is really, I'd say, the heroine of the film. I mean, she's being filmed while she's in deep mourning. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think back to my mother was 51 at the time, and from where I'm sitting now, that's a young widow. Uh-huh. You know? And there she is subjecting herself to interviews, to being followed around with a camera, and my sister, of course, who was such an intense year for her. She's, on the one hand, she's mourning, on the other hand, she's preparing for her wedding. Right. And so for the two of them to have really stepped up in the way that they did is really extraordinary. You know, for me, I always had a kind of a public role. I was always, you know, I was writing from an early age for local Jewish newspapers, a Soviet Jewry activist, making speeches. So you showing up with a camera wasn't that big of a change for me.
It fit right in.
Yeah, and my father.
One of the things that made your family and your story so attractive was this treasure trove of photographs of being arrested, of being, you know, hauled off. I think it was the Daily News, I forget, you know, in a police van at a Soviet Jewry demonstration. And then later on, I actually found footage of you at a demonstration. As I was going through Soviet Jewry demonstrations, I found a group of demonstrators dancing, and there you were with your fist up. So there, and you told me about that fantastic footage that never had aired when you guys came back from Russia after getting arrested for trying to take over the Soviet immigration office. 7 young activists beaten up and finally sent home. And there was footage when they got back to the airport here, and there was really good stuff in there, and it never aired, but they still had it at NBC News. So we were able to get that because Yossi remembered that. Sorry, go ahead, Yossi.
And then if you remember, I'd say Steve and I had a serious miscommunication about one major absence in the film, which is my involvement with the Jewish Defense League, with Mayor Kahana and the whole violent wing of the Soviet Jewry movement. And I was surprised when I saw the film and there was no mention of the JDL. And my assumption was, well, Steve just wanted to airbrush that out of my biography because it was too controversial. And years later, Steve comes to me and says, why didn't you ever tell me that you were in the JDL?
I found out about it when I read your book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. And I said,
yeah. And it's funny, you know, one of the reasons that I wrote that book is that I felt that whole part of my life hadn't been in the film. And so in a way, that book was my version of the film. And so I'm sorry, Steve, about that. I never told you, but there we have it.
I knew that you had thrown bags of blood at the ballet. So I knew that, you know, that didn't sound like student struggle for Soviet Jewry, but somehow I didn't make the connection to
Right.
JDL, and I couldn't Google you then and see, aha. So I missed that one. You have any more questions? But we should talk, I think, maybe about the relevance. You know, why today, 40 years later, why should people even want to see this film again?
And what made you choose to revive the film?
Yossi was saying, you know, we should really do a DVD. And I had the, what happened was
it was Yossi's initiative?
Yossi egged me on to do it because I was busy working on another project. But what had happened was the film had been in distribution. And my distributor wanted to do a DVD, and I didn't like the terms they'd set. And I wound up taking the film away. Then I found out later that they had actually lost the original negative and the original interpositive, the master materials for the film. I had the soundtrack, the original 35 millimeter mix, which was the audio, which was in great condition, but the negative was gone. And so we had to figure, well, how can we even do this? So I wanted to preserve the film. It was a question of keeping the film alive. So future generations could see it, because it did make a mark in Jewish American filmmaking. It's cited a bit. And it got an extraordinary response when it first came out. So I happen to find who's got a print of the film? I know I had 11 prints, but they were in terrible condition. They'd been screened, they had scratches. Turns out the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center had a print of this film. So I went there to screen it, and it was in great shape. So they let us use that. It had a few defects, which we used other prints to make up for. So it was a mix match of different prints, but the prints were good. You know, and we took it and we scanned it, we did a 5K scan and color correction and a lot of what I call schmutz removal, which is getting rid of the dirt, a little dirt on the frame, which is very annoying to watch. And I went to Indie Collect, who did a fantastic job. They are a nonprofit that specializes in restoring independent film. They're dedicated to the preservation of independent film. And they did a remarkable job with it. And we got it out. So that's, and thanks to the Memorial Foundation, that got us going. Their grant got us going to restore it. And then Sundance came in, the Sundance Institute came in and put in some more. So we've been able to do the full restoration, which was shown at the New York Jewish Film Festival. And we're now working on a 2 DVD sets with a booklet. And people say, well, why DVDs? Nobody watches DVDs anymore. Apparently they do. People who would be interested in this film buy DVDs, apparently.
Behind me are hundreds of Israeli music CDs. And I don't have the heart to put them in boxes. I just love them. I love this so much.
Here, I have records, I have CDs, I have DVDs, and I'm not going to throw them away. But
getting back to why it's relevant, though.
But how?
It's wonderful for us. It's nice to preserve the film, for us, for our families, what have you. But the subject matter.
So it was really a sense of legacy, not only Zoltan's legacy, but now your own legacy.
In a sense, yeah.
Sure.
And what's a legacy? It's a period of time in American history and American Jewish history when a lot was, and European Jewish history, that covers a lot of ground between the Holocaust, the Soviet Jewry movement, living in America, radical Jewish newspapers, like the New Jewish Times that Yossi started, post-apocalyptic thought. You know, how do you live after an apocalypse? That's kind of pretty much the theme of the film. How do you integrate that into your life? And that was what I think Yossi was constantly dealing with through many, many, many years. Am I correct in saying that, Yoss?
It's okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I think, if anything, there's so many people can relate to an experience, not that experience, but an experience of displacement, persecution, being thrown out of your country, being seen as the other, and having to deal with that, and having to leave your culture, whether it's Jewish, whether it's Cambodian, whether it's Rwandan, whether it's you name it, and start afresh. And what do? Is my culture my heirloom, or is it my tormentor? Is it going to wind up destroying me? Those are the things people have to deal with, right?
You know, there's one more thing actually that I'd just like to add. When I talk about the heroes of this film, I really want to talk about Steve Brandt, because Steve was so patient and persistent, and that's a really powerful combination for an artist. And this film took far longer to make than we thought it would, partly because we kept running out of money.
Right.
And Steve was trying to start a career and get going and make a living, and he really persisted. And this film really is it's, you know, when I look at this film, I feel like I'm really watching Steve's film. I don't feel like I'm watching my film, which is exactly how it should be. And when we made the decision that I would step in front of the camera and not be simultaneously behind the camera, and that this really would be Steve's film, something really changed for me in my relationship to the process. And I had to let go. I had to really cede control, which was difficult at first. But actually, when I think back on the process, the going through the grieving and the shock of the loss really, I think, helped me in a way, helped free me from any lingering need to try to control the direction of the film. And I really didn't know how the film was going to turn out, I think, really until I saw it. And by this time, of course, I was in Israel. The film came out in 1984, and I wasn't even here for the premiere.
But your mother was.
My mother certainly was, and my mother remarried, and her husband Leo was so gracious in accompanying her. He hired a limousine for the premiere. That's, he was this European Jew, and he thought that's what you do at a movie premiere. So and he really wanted to show my mother his complete support, which is extraordinary because it's a film about her first husband, and they hadn't been married that long, and so there he was with my mother at the premiere, treating her as a celebrity. And so these are some of the backstories. I think that there's a lot of humanity around the making of this film.
And in this film.
And in the film.
It's the film, it documents the mourning process of one survivor who was really unable to go through a similar mourning process for his parents, really. He didn't even find out until he got out of this hole that he was in for 6 months that his parents had perished.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, all those survivors who never had a chance to, you know, to know where their parents are buried, to say Kaddish, it's a very, very different thing. And the other thing about the film taking so long that was actually to its benefit, strangely, was that after a few years, they planned this world gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors in Jerusalem, the first ever. And Yossi went with two hats, right? You went there as a childless survivor and also to cover it as a journalist. And we went over with him. We raised the final piece of the pie to document that and to take it. So we went from the tree in the forest back to the forest at the end. And you see it in the context of all of these survivors and all these children of survivors, and all these families who have had to deal with this all these years and make their adjustments, their life adjustments to it. So that was really fortunate that we were able to capture that as well. You know, and I mean, Yossi, you may not have been producing the film yourself, but we gave you an audio cassette player to talk to. There were parts of the film after your father passed away that we felt, you know, you had a lot on your mind and think about, and why don't you just talk to the tape recorder and, you know, see what comes up for you. And I think that gave him some privacy that he could then share with us, and that could also be incorporated in the film, you know. And then the last interview we did, I wasn't even there for. It was in Israel when you were sitting on the balcony, like after the world gathering, sort of putting it all together. And I think you just talked to the camera. I don't remember if anybody was even asking questions there. Do you recall? You know,
not at all.
Not at all. but yeah, we did a recap of your feelings about the world gathering. And that was very powerful. So it came together in many, many ways. And, you know, there's also, I mean, the film is a pro-Israel film. The family we have a Zionist family and Yossi, the film ends with Yossi making Aliyah to Israel. And today, with all that's going on, you know, agree or disagree with some of Israel's policies, you've got virulent anti-Semitism rising again. You've got the BDS movement. I would love to have this film shown on college campuses where they're struggling with this issue, because it gives, you know, a side of what's going on, this kind of the psyche, the Israeli psyche that's somewhat been missing in the conversation recently. You know, not that you know, make the Holocaust doesn't make everything, you know, acceptable, you know, ever onward, but it's a context. And as Yossi also pointed out, I mean, most Israelis today don't have a direct connection to the Holocaust, right? A
majority of Israelis
Israel because
come from families that were from the Middle East. You know?
Yeah.
Yossi, you said that this is Steve's film. I agree. But if it were your film, would you end it any differently? Or if you had or would you do anything different to reflect you?
You know, I mentioned earlier that I wrote my first book, and in a way, as the film that I would have made. And the title of the book, I think, is in a way a response as well. It's Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. It's really emphasizing the immersion into the extremist mindset and the process of gradually emerging from what I would call a kind of a self-impairment, a limiting of one's being. And for very understandable reasons and all the rest of it. But the book is really an attempt to understand the mindset of a post-Holocaust Jewish extremist. And if you look at what's happening in Israel today with the rise of far-right extremism, certainly in the religious Zionist community among young people, I see this in some sense as a belated response several generations later. But I think that what we're seeing erupting in Israel is something of that in a very different context. It's in the context of an ongoing and seemingly hopeless war with the Palestinians, with a large part of the Arab world. But the expressions, and we just saw it the other day in Jerusalem, the march of the flags of tens of thousands of young people with racist chants and anti-Arab chants and a fair bit of random violence. This for me is psychologically familiar, and so the book that I wrote really emphasizes that experience. And you know, my turn to the right began very early. When I was 13, I joined the Beitar youth movement, which was the most right-wing Zionist youth movement in those years, the youth movement of Menachem Begin and Jabotinsky. And then I went through the Soviet Jewry movement and went on to Meir Kahane. And so it was really important for me to explain the extremist mindset. And with everything happening in Israel today, I feel it's even more important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Actually, one of the questions for the audience from Steve Lippman addresses exactly this, so maybe I will pick on it now. Steve Lippman writes, I recently read Memoirs, and it wasn't exactly clear to me what brought the break between Yossi and Kahane, and by extension, the JDL ? Was it just Yossi, quotes, grew up and saw Kahane for what he was? Was it something else? And what would you say to, quote, young Yossi that fell in with Kahane and his ilk? Today, I have friends that don't even remember Kahane and the racism that he represented. It's troubling. So would you address Steve Lippman's question?
Yeah, so hi, Steve. I would say that the process that I tried to describe in the book is very gradual. In retrospect, the breaking point was the death by accident in a JDL firebombing attack of a young woman, a secretary. And that was not my reaction at the time. At the time, I closed ranks. I became very defensive, protective of Kahane and the JDL, and got more deeply immersed, actually. But that for me was the beginning of the break. And there wasn't a cathartic moment. There's no one moment that I can point to and say, that's when I realized it. It was, I would say really my growing up process was very much connected with beginning to experience the world outside of my own anger, outside of my own trauma. It had to do with going to graduate school where I studied journalism. I went to Northwestern University. That was my first time where I encountered the wide world and had non-Jewish friends. So there were, and I didn't write about that in the book. The book really focuses much more on the political side of my story. But personally, the backstory certainly was realizing that the way in which I was experiencing the world was very different than how most people do. And I was curious. I was curious about other people. I was curious about how other people see the world. And that's what drew me to journalism. And curiosity is a very subversive trait for an extremist, because an extremist needs, you need a constant self affirmation of your ideas. The worst thing for an extremist is to ask that question, well, how does this same problem or this same experience look like to that guy? And then if you take that a little bit farther and farther, how does it look to my political opponent? Then you're really on dangerous ground. And it becomes impossible to sustain the cocoon in which an extremist needs to thrive.
Rappaport asks in the same way, Yossi, as a former member of the JDL, what is your view of Kahana's successor, Ben Gvir? But I want to go back to the film.
Very simple. He's the single, to my mind, one of the most dangerous people in the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to add something to what Yossi said, because it struck me as you were describing this mindset and the threat that curiosity poses to it. This is the age we're living right now. That's happening right here. There's a lot of extremism of thought, humanization of the other. And there's a lot of curiosity lacking in this world about, the people you just dismiss on both sides. So that's, I think it makes it even more. And, in the film itself, although we didn't catch the JDL part of your journey, there's still an apocalyptic extremism there was in your persona.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
And
that also.
Yeah. Go ahead, guys.
For me, that's the charm of the film, is the apocalypse.
Well, it's interesting. I always felt, one of the lines that gets quoted in the film is when we talked about your definition of being Jewish, and you talked about being on the verge of revelation, on the verge of extermination. Always being on the verge of annihilation. And it occurs to me, and I always saw you at that time as sort of being on the verge of things. If things were going on, if this was what was happening on the mainstream, you were on the verge over here. And I think today, as a centrist, in a funny way, that puts you on the verge of things still, because you're on the verge of these radical mindsets, uncurious mindsets on either side.
Yeah, I made Aliyah. I moved to Israel in the summer of 1982, and I'm being very specific about the summer of '82 because that was the beginning of what we now call the First Lebanon War.
That's right. And
the First Lebanon War was the first and only time that Israel went to war and we were tearing each other apart. We usually, a security crisis brings Israelis together, as it has since then. But in the summer of 1982, the country was dysfunctional. And that experience of joining Israeli society when it was unable to come together in the middle of a war was for me a formative break. I would say my final break with the mindset of extremism happened that summer when I realized the consequences of being barricaded in opposing positions where you're incapable of hearing the other side. And that, of course, is a good definition for how political discourse is happening today, both in Israel and certainly in America. And I was shocked into becoming a centrist by joining a society that seemed to be falling apart.
Before we continue toward the present, there is a question about still left over from the film, which I would like you to address. Glenn Marcus asks, not to stray from the theme of this remarkably groundbreaking film and its great relevance today, but what became of the other two in Zoltan's whole bunker, and Yossi's sister, The Candy Business, the other writers for New York Times? Yes, I know, details, but that's the sign of a good film, isn't it? That people want to know more.
Well, very briefly, my sister recently retired. She was a teacher for many years in special ed. And I think that's really an expression of who she is as a person. She's really a person of heart and of service. And that, I think, comes through in the film. And she's really quite a remarkable person, and has a big and growing family of, I think, 10 grandchildren. Sorry, Khani, if I got the number wrong. The question about, the candy business, my brother-in-law, Glenn, took it over very ably. And it still exists in different form. The nature of the business has changed over the years. In terms of the other two, the people who were in my father's bunker with him, I don't know. I never did know. In the summer of 1967, I went with my father to Israel. That was my first trip. And I described this scene in Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. We were in Haifa, and my father takes me into this butcher shop. And the butcher sees my father and just weeps and falls on him, and then starts kissing me on both cheeks and kisses me again. And I don't know who this guy is, you know. And this whole intense experience lasts for 5 minutes, you know. And I don't know if my father, if he knew we were coming, you know. It was different then. Communication was different. People wrote letters, and if you didn't write letters, you didn't call. I mean, from America it is. So I think we just showed up in this butcher shop. And afterwards I asked my father, who was that guy? And I thought, another second or third relative. I called them Holocaust relatives, these third relatives once removed. And he said, that was one of the boys from the hole. And I just, I don't even remember what the guy looked like, because I didn't think he was anyone important. And so that's the first and last time that I ever heard or met. And that was it. That was the experience. And to this day, I don't understand what happened, why it happened that way, why it was so brief, why my father didn't tell me we're going to meet this guy. The whole thing's a big mystery to me. And in some way, I think my father just wanted to put this behind him. That's the only explanation that I have. Why didn't we get together with the families? Why did my father go meet his children? The whole thing is a mystery. It's a crazy Holocaust story. I don't know what else.
One of the Holocaust mystery stories.
Yeah. Oh, and the question also was the other writers for New Jewish Times. Jonathan Mark wrote for many years brilliantly in his inimical style for the New York Jewish Week. He did these fantastic Jewish profiles. And Izzy Lemberg, our co-editor, died a month ago, and at age 66, and was for many years senior CNN producer here in Jerusalem, an amazing person, an amazing journalist. And I'm actually literally now just coming from the shloshim, from the ceremony after a month of mourning where his stone was unveiled. And Izzy is somebody who, if I could just take a moment to talk about Izzy. Izzy is somebody who lived the Jewish people. He was born in Kiev, grew up with tremendous anti-Semitism, moved with his family to the US when he was 13, became a Soviet Jewry activist. We became friends as teenagers. Izzy is my oldest and longest continuous friend that I've had from America through my years in Israel. And Izzy is somebody who really lived his name, Israel. He totally identified with the Jewish people, with the struggles of the Jewish people, and amazingly died on the anniversary, the 74th anniversary of the state of Israel. And that's what's on his stone. Hey Be'iyar, the Hebrew date of the founding of the state. So thank you, Glenn, for the opportunity to bring Izzy into the conversation.
Glenn is also continuing the conversation, saying Zoltan's brilliant personal explanation of God and the Holocaust was remarkable in its simplicity, and the chilling words out of Egypt into the crematoria.
And then out again.
And out again.
So here we are.
And the film has, and Zoltan in the film has many of these amazing moments that ring true today too. Any other moment floats back to you, both Steve and Yossi?
Yes, when we were first talking about this webinar, Yael, I said, you need to change the description because it says discussing, with the filmmaker and the protagonists. I said, but it's just Yossi. And Yael said, no, actually it's Zoltan too. The protagonists of the film. And you're right, he hovers over it. As a matter of fact, when the DVD comes out, which will be sometime between now and September through Kino Lorber is distributing, there's a 30 years later interview with Yossi.
Yes.
And which is one of the bonus features. And in it, we talk about the voice. Yossi talked about how the voice of Zoltan Klein needs to be heard. You want to say something more about that, Yossi?
Well, it's amazing, really, because my father was such a natural on camera, and he had been waiting for years for somebody to show up with a camera. And Steve, he loved you. He really did. And he was so grateful to you to give him the platform that he never thought he would have. And he used to speak to me obsessively when I was a kid because I was going to be his platform. And I mean, it's pretty amazing. He was right. He actually, he invested, he groomed me. And the first article that I wrote, which does feature in the film, was of course his story. That's the first piece that I published. I was 12 years old, and there it is, in the Jewish press, the Brooklyn
Centerfold.
And so my father never thought he'd have the opportunity. I was always going to be his spokesman. And when my father realized that I was interested in writing, he was thrilled, and he used to really encourage me. And then, of course, he started having misgivings that I was taking it too seriously, and instead of having a real career. And so he said, I think I say this in the film. I don't remember, but I haven't seen the film through for many, many years. I've seen bits of it, but my father made sure that I played the accordion because because when he was in Cuba, his friend who played the accordion was able to get by. And he used to say to me, you know, that you need to have the piece of paper, you know, to have a diploma. He wanted me to be a PhD, which I never had any interest in. And he wanted that because wherever you ended up, you always had the piece paper, you know. So and again, I don't remember if this is in the film, but you know, when I always had this idea, you know, well, yeah, I'm going to be the accordionist professor, and that's how I'm going to survive the next Holocaust. Well, you know, all bases covered. And in the end, though, here you show up with the camera, and he was so eloquent, but you have to understand that he'd been waiting for years to be able to tell his story and to offer his pronouncements about what he thought the way that American Jews need to think about their Jewishness.
And you know, one of those interviews, the black and white interview in the film, is the one you did with your father, which is at the very beginning of the film. There's some black and white footage where you interviewed your father. You know, and then that was in black and white, and then we interviewed him later. And I really, you know, I was looking forward to interviewing him again. I had more questions for him, you know.
Me too.
Yeah.
I remember that time.
Now, especially. Now I have questions for him.
Yes,
what questions do you have? What would you like to ask him now?
You know, I'm very curious about the transition that he made from those first weeks to becoming the person that I knew. And there are a couple of moments that I really wish that I knew more about. For example, and I don't remember if this is in the film, and if it isn't, I wish he had talked about it. He said he turned his parents' house, which was a big house. His parents were, and he does talk about his parents as being quite wealthy. They were among the wealthiest people in town, and he turns this house into a refuge for these teenage girls coming back from the camps. Is that in the film?
No, it's not. As a matter of fact, he talked about coming back and all these homes had been appropriated, taken away. What was his experience with it? How did he manage to get a whole access to it?
It's interesting. Again, you know, I have only very, very flimsy details here. And, but it seems that the Red Army requisitioned most of the house, but he was allowed to stay in part of the house. And he turned however many rooms he was given into a shelter for teenage girls. Now, the reason this was so important is because the Red Army were basically rapists.
Yes.
They moved.
They still are.
They moved through Europe raping, and so my father is protecting these teenage kids who. And the thing about Hungarian Jewry that's so I think so unique in terms of the Shoah is that the Polish Jews had years of being worn down. The Hungarian Jews went from quasi-normal life to Auschwitz. More or less, there were a couple of weeks in a ghetto, and then the deportation. And so these girls are totally traumatized. They're coming, many of them, from sheltered religious homes, and now a year later, they're back. And so this, for me, is really a key moment. in terms of my father's own healing process of taking care of others. And so that's something that I really would have wanted to explore with him. And I have all kinds of other questions about the hole. Like, you know, you're living in a hole for 6 months. Like, what's going on in the hole? Are there snakes? I'm terrified of snakes. What's in the hole? You know, what happens when you immerse in the earth for 6 months? It's a pretty unique human story. There aren't too many people I would imagine in the course of human history that had that experience of being immersed in a hole for so long. So these are the questions. They're much more, they're not historical questions. They're not the issues that he really wanted to talk about. They're much more personal.
They are exactly psychohistorical questions.
Yeah.
He wanted to be a monument. Remember, you talked about it. He presented himself as a monument.
Exactly. And he felt that the details of his personal life were irrelevant. He was the survivor, and this is the message. And
the kids all want to know the details.
Yeah,
we want to know. Well, you know, what was that other guy like in the hole? You know, what else happened besides putting your jaw in his mouth when he went crazy? You know,
yeah, that was a good story, but it was like one of the only personal details that he told. You know, it's just
a survival story.
It's
a survival tip.
It's a metaphor for the Jewish people. That's how he saw it.
Steve, it's interesting that you're talking about the children want to know the details because your father didn't speak. Do you want to speak about?
Sure. One of the interesting things for me in making this film was the difference between Yossi's relationship with his father's way of dealing with what happened to him and my father's way. My father, well, he was younger when he experienced, that's one thing. I mean, I think your father was about 25 or so when he went into the hole in the ground, right?
25, which is relatively older.
Yeah.
For a survivor,
For a survivor. We forget that.
My parents both were from Vienna. And so they were there for the Anschluss and also for Kristallnacht, when the night of broken glass, when in Germany and Austria, when they burned down most of the synagogues and threw people in jail and took people off to the camps and beat people up on the streets. And my father was out on the street, and he was 15 in 1938, and he was rounded up on the streets, put on a wagon to take to the train station. And he saw his mother on the street, and she saw him on the wagon. And when he got to the train station, his brother was already there, his older brother. And his brother said to one of the guards, "What do you want with him for? He's only 15 years old. Why don't you send him home?" For whatever reason, they sent my father home. And his brother went to Dachau. Fortunately, for only a few months, because you could get out then. He was able to get a work visa and get out. This was 38. But my father never talked about it. I mean, it's got to be very tough to go through that. He did talk about it finally. I interviewed him many years later. As a matter of fact, hopefully after the Heschel film, I'll be doing a film about my family, because they had this great love story.
Oh, really? Is that on?
Possibly, we'll see. They were childhood sweethearts. He went to South America with his father had 5 brothers in South America, so they went to Buenos Aires, and my mother and her sister went to London and then New York, and were able to get their parents out finally, but they kept corresponding, and my father kept bugging his parents. They have to leave South America. So they get to New York, finally, after a year later, and my mother, who's by then, I think 17 maybe, was on the dock with a fake fur stole, a fake fox stole around her neck, waiting for the ship to come in, you know? And so it was, even Hitler couldn't keep them apart. That's sort of the tagline on it. And the other funny thing was that, you know, you would never know it was, they were such a hot romance, you know, growing up, because they were so reserved around the kids in expressing their feelings for each other. It was very interesting.
Yuckas.
And you also separately, you mention it in the film when you ask your father, Yossi, how far should I go?
Yeah. You
remember that amazing moment?
Oh.
Yeah, and the two of you have a different story about it. So the audience knows that different children of survivors adapt differently to all kinds of different stories.
It's instructive.
I actually don't remember ever asking him how far I should go. Or
he remembered. He remembered, or he emphasized that said that.
And it's understandable why.
But just in case you wanted to know.
It's a rather complex moment.
Right.
So for those who haven't seen the film yet, it was a unique moment in the film. He was reminiscing. He said, once Yossi asked me, how far should I go in demonstrating for these Jewish causes? He's sitting in this very comfortable armchair saying, I said I would go as far as sit down, lie down in the middle of the street.
Lie down.
The car has to go through me. I would let it go through. Lie down in the middle of the street. He said, so he did. So did my daughter. You know, they did. He said, it's okay if they're doing it for prevent Jewish suffering, unjust suffering, let them do it. They'll survive. So that was his take on.
That was more similar to what I call the fighter style.
Exactly. So on my side, in 1968, I was 18 years old, and I was supporting Gene McCarthy, who was running against LBJ for president. And I was about to go to a rally, and I had a placard. You know, I wasn't exactly clean for Gene, but I was, you know, I was definitely a supporter. And I was ready to leave the house. My father blocks the door. He won't let me out of, he wouldn't let me out of the house. And we had this big struggle, and he broke the placard.
What was he afraid of?
He was afraid that there are people recording things at the demonstration. This is not safe. Somebody's going to be taking pictures. Your name will go down. You're going to be picked up in the middle of the night one day. You know, he didn't say that, but that was the thought process. And I said, Dad, this is ridiculous. It's America. This is a democracy, right? Say that today. Maybe you have a different story. But he said, no way. And we struggled. We wrestled, and we actually knocked over. We broke a table, a coffee table, a little table sitting in the hall that probably came from Vienna. And we knocked over the table, leg of the table. So two different responses to, you know, lie down in the middle of the street, you'll survive, and let's be a little more cautious. Let's fight another day. This is don't be too public. And those are two survivor responses.
There used to be a saying, an angry Jew is a dead Jew.
Well, that, I think my father knew that saying.
Yeah, I think so. And so it's very interesting how the conversation goes past, present, future, which is just fine. So we don't have to make like a seminar of the relevance as separate from everything we're speaking about. But there are two friends here to Yossi. Elaine Howard writes, how should American Jews think about their Jewishness? Asks this Chicagoan. Some are tuned out or casual. My Israeli cousin is a Shoah survivor. He says it took 2 years to make a mensch out of me, although I was a committed Jew before. Hopefully he succeeded. So this is Elaine's question. And then Laurie Kimmelstiel says, Thank you so much for this. Yossi's influence on me as a fellow Jewish activist in high school remains a critical part of who I became as a Jewish adult and Zionist, and my first exposure to the Holocaust and children of survivors.
Well, Elaine,
can you respond to that? There are several other very interesting comments.
Yeah, Elaine, I really don't know how to respond to that. I'm very hesitant to tell American Jews what to do, how to be Jewish. I only hope that the connection with Israel will remain strong for American Jews. I think it's important. It's certainly important for Israel, but these days I think it's actually more important for American Jews. And Israel does need the support, not as much I think as we used to, but I think that the American Jewish community more than ever needs the vitality that Israeli culture, Israeli society has, and it's a whole. I think that the two communities have a lot to learn from each other and really need each other. Laurie, I'm just so happy to see you on the call, and I remember an article you wrote for the high school Jewish activist newspaper that we all worked on. And really, it's a closing of a circle. So thank you for joining us.
Let me continue. Stephen Rusek. I know before him, there's a question. What do you think your father would have thought about your involvement with the JDL?
Well, he was alive then, and he didn't think much of it.
Really? Interesting.
He was really worried. Unlike Steve's father, who really, I don't think had much reason to worry about supporting Gene McCarthy for president, my father had good reason to worry about the JDL. Mm-hmm. And he didn't know the half of it. And I don't know how much he suspected. And at a certain point, I think he realized that as a parent does, you reach the point where you realize that whatever you say is counterproductive. That it's just, and so we just didn't talk about it. That's my memory.
And Stephen Rusek writes to you, Yossi, the story of you and your dad visiting the butcher reminds me of a similar situation on my first trip to Israel with my mom and dad. I liken these encounters to a box of puzzle pieces that we only finish putting together when our parents are gone.
Who wrote that?
This is Stephen Rusek, R-U-S-E-K.
Hi, Stephen. Hi, Stephen.
And he says that this analogy resonates with you.
Yeah, and I think that there are so many pieces that we're never going to have access to, and that's part of the sadness of a generation passing, and there's nobody left that I could ask these questions to.
May I speak as a psychologist for the moment, that the answers most likely are in you, if you, as he is in many ways. So, and this is for the audience as well.
Yeah.
But I want to, rather than speak, I would rather speak for the people so everybody's engaged. Hannah Grippo says, as a teacher and a Jew, I do deeply share about the Holocaust and after with my students, stories of the murdered and survivors. The children are open, but parents often ask me why. But I don't always know what the best answer is. I will never stop sharing, but I wonder what your answer would be if someone asked you that. Why must we tell our next generation?
Steve, do you want to take that?
I was hoping you would. No,
this audience asks very, very easy questions.
No.
Go ahead, Steve. That's one of those easy questions.
Yeah, it's a question the film opens up because, you know, I mean, the immediate questions I had, many people have, is bedtime stories. That's pretty rough to get this kind of information as bedtime stories. But it's like, but when is the right time? You know, I mean, it's something that I, you know, deal with, you know, and why is a very interesting question. You know, why, if you don't even have a personal relationship? I guess because you're a citizen of the world, because these things happen in the world you live in, and can rehappen in various shades, various formats. So, you know, perhaps there's something to be learned from this experience. No, it's tough. As a parent wants to protect their child. And as a matter of fact, that's what Zoltan was doing when those bedtime stories were a form of protection for him. It says, get you ready to prepare you. But you want, you know, look, do we have a choice about telling our kids about school shootings? About you know, we live in a world where horrible things happen.
Do you want to speak as a father for a moment?
You know, well, I actually, it's interesting. After the recent horrific shooting in Uvalde, Texas, my wife said we should say something. I have an 8-year-old. I have a 39-year-old and I have an 8-year-old. It's a long story. It's another webinar. But she said we should say something. We should say something. I didn't want to tell him. I didn't want. It's like it was too horrible. But I'd rather that he not hear it from other kids, and get like some kind of a perverted version of what happened. So we did in as simple a form as possible, and you know, and the same thing with. You know, I think it's important for people to know about these things because, you know, I mean, you get, as an adult, you get faced with decisions. Do we ignore what's horrible things that are going on in the world if they don't affect us directly? Or do we see can we try to do something, you know, to help make it better, to prevent these things from happening? And that to me would be the reason you would want to tell Yossi?
Yeah. Hannah, first of all, really glad you're on the call, and great to speak with you even impersonally. I think the question really is why the Holocaust specifically? There are so many atrocities, they accumulate. There's a growing tendency to conflate the Holocaust with other atrocities, or to turn the Holocaust into a generic story of racism, of intolerance, of the need for brotherhood, and I'm all for that. But I think the Holocaust is a much bigger story. The Holocaust is a story of Western civilization. It's a story of the collapse of what was considered to be the most advanced country in the West, the most sophisticated. And it's a story.
And the most cultured.
The most cultured. The most cultured.
Yes.
Jews loved Germany. Jews wanted to be Germans, what they wanted more than anything else. And so there's something in for me, the universal significance of the Holocaust is not one more atrocity or one more example of racism. We have enough. We don't need the Holocaust for that. The Holocaust is a story about the end of the world. It's about civilization committing suicide and using the elements of civilization, bureaucracy, government, order, industry, using all of these elements for mass destruction. And this is the story that I think we're trying to tell, and I'm not sure it's getting across. So that's in terms of why this story matters generally. And I think for Jews, the question is, why do we find ourselves at the center of people's perverse obsessions? And that's a pattern, and it keeps playing itself out. And to my mind, it's playing itself out now with Israel. And that's not to say that the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews in the Holocaust and stigmatizing Israel is the same, because in the Holocaust, Jews had no power. And when you have no power, you are completely innocent. And we made the decision, the right decision, I think, to take power after the Shoah. And yet our power is now being singled out as the ultimate example of criminal power. And that's a story that I think really brings us back to the question, why? Why are we always turned into a symbol for the world's evil? And that's a question that I was trying to ask when we were making the film. And it's become much sharper for me in recent years. So I think that there is a strong universal argument for the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And from a Jewish perspective, there's something there that really, there's something we need to confront about, and that's the question of why.
Mm-hmm. And Ruth, thank you. Ruth Gito indeed acknowledges that you're describing the victim mentality that your dad and my dad shared. And in answer to Elaine, she's not to Elaine, but to...
No, that's my cousin Ruth. She was talking.
Oh, that's your cousin Ruth. Hi.
Hi, Ruth.
And she said, and you said, Ruth, that we have to tell because to never forget. That is another huge aspect. I want to, so that was partly an answer to you, Hannah. There is a question from Harold Kudler. I felt that the resolution of the film had to do with Yossi's trying to figure out how to be a son to a father who is quoted on Monument. He seems to have come to an important turning point during the Jerusalem gathering of survivors. Does that feel right to Yossi and Steve? And how might Yossi see the story continuing between him and his own children?
Well, Steve, I think you did say that, I mean, that really was the culmination of the film. And
it was, and it was also, I think, where I mean, it's interesting. You articulated the same thought much earlier on in our interviews about the seeing ourselves as survivors rather than as victims. You know, you have a choice. How are you going to view your life story, your people's story? And I think the World Gathering brought that to a head in a way, and with the moment with the Yemenite Jews playing the shofar at the very end. That's kind of an eerie moment, that remarkable, almost mystical moment of this cacophony of shofar blowing, kind of releasing things and breaking through to the other side. And that I don't know, I think you came out of that with hope, but you had that same hope very early on. You didn't express it as much. It came up, you know, here and there in the survival, you know, story. In the talk you gave in 1977 at the yeshiva, where you talked about you who survived didn't turn your back on Judaism. God who took us out of Egypt and into the crematorium and out again. So maybe if you, by the end of that process at the World Conference, I don't know if you were experiencing it perhaps more deeply after going through losing your father and not having him there with you, but being surrounded by this in Israel also. That was really a very important part of the gathering, that it was in Jerusalem, it was in Israel at the wall.
Yeah, you know, for me, the main takeaway, and I see Laurie's comment here, Ruth Wise thinks we should avoid making the Holocaust our legacy and teach more of the Jewish gifts of our history in a more positive way. I'm writing a book now about the post-Holocaust era and how the Jews overcame the Holocaust. And the question of the book is, how did we get from the lowest point in our history to what I think we can reasonably regard as the peak moment of Jewish history, or certainly one of the peaks, which is today. And the switch for me in terms of understanding what it means to be a survivor people is we're not the people that went through the Holocaust as much as we are the people that overcame the Holocaust. And the book that I'm working on actually begins with my father emerging from the hole. And the hole becomes this kind of metaphor. I'm just giving away the first paragraph. So the hole becomes, you know, a metaphor for the literal resurrection of the Jewish people. And so that's, you know, I feel that that's, I very much appreciate the point you're raising, Laurie. And it's for me, that's the core of the contemporary Jewish story. And if I could just say one last point about this, you know, in the Haggadah, we're told to imagine ourselves as if we ourselves left Egypt. We're never told to imagine ourselves as if we were slaves in Egypt. We're told to remember we were slaves in Egypt, learn the lessons, and empathize with the oppressed, etc. But we are never told to remember the slavery of Egypt as if you were slaves there, because that experience doesn't belong to us. And I can't write about my father in the hole. That's his experience. My experience of my father begins the day he comes out of the hole. That's when, in a sense, we become contemporaries. We both become post-Holocaust Jews at that moment. And all of us, and Jews forever after, are going to be post-Holocaust Jews.
And getting back to your point about what and why should I tell my kid about the Holocaust, you know, there's the Haggadah, you know, and there's, you know, we're always remembering. And, you know, as a way of, you know, don't forget, but don't just dwell where you were. But in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you've been.
So speaking of memory, I just remembered that we are now past my bedtime.
No, you didn't just remember it. Joyce Gottlieb wrote, glad Yossi did not leave it to me. Yeah, and I told you to be loose, and here we are. So can we just first? I would like I did not call on the first comment that was made by Aaron Cohen and his wife Esther, who made an amazing film on Mexican children of survivors called Whispers of Silence, that came out in the last 3 years. And so it's 40 years later, and it would be very interesting to have a webinar toward an additional webinar on that. Thank you, Aaron. Also, Steve, I think you promised Estelle to mention and to put in the chat
I'll have to do there. There's a link
to put
for educators.
You did mention that you know, about making the CDs of the
Let me just say one.
You still will have the last.
Okay, fine.
So I just want to remind you, because you promised it to Estelle. There is a question from Glenn. Will the recording of this webinar be made available per chance? Absolutely. All our webinars are on our website. There are others that I'm sure you would love to watch as well. Although this is hard to live up to, which you knew ahead of time, which is why you came. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, no, hopefully all the registrants will later get an email once the webinar is up on the website with a link, so how they can, because a lot of people who registered may not have been able to come here live for this, but can watch it later with the link. I think that would be great to do.
Oh, Shai or Rabbi, would you please post the website?
I was just going to say the website. Oh yeah, the website.
We need two websites. We need. Hello, Cecile. Thanks to panelists. Oops. And organizing team. This webinar. Oh, where are you? This webinar is very interesting and important. Thank you. God bless you, Cecile. This is from Rwanda, I believe. So we need another webinar, at least one more webinar, if not more, to speak about similarities and, you know, to share among the different cataclysmic events that the center represents. And Ayla Hill said, thank you so much, so very much. What a joy to listen to your creative journey as it unfolds and your sharing with gratitude. Thank you, Ayla. Please join our future webinars as well. And you have now, everyone has in the chat, the website to the ICMGLT, to the center's website. And that's twice. And Steve, you should put the link for
just put the link to the website for the film, kaddishdocumentary.com, where people can learn about screenings coming up and when the DVD is coming out and how to get that. I don't have the that link, the Kino Lorber link, but I will.
There is the link. I see. There's a link to the film now. Yes, thank you, Yossi, for saying that. Yes, yeah, and here there is the link to Steve, to the Kaddish documentary.com. Perfect. Okay. Right. Now you do have, as we usually do you have sort of a last word before I go to speak about future webinars?
I just want to thank you, Yael, for the opportunity to hang out with Yossi for a while, and you, and talk about this experience. I hope it was helpful in some way or enlightening in some way to folks listening. Thanks for the opportunity, Yossi. It's great to see you. I loved hearing about your new book. Your kind of new old book, digging back dig out. So that's great. And thank you all who've come to listen. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and Yael, thank you for initiating, and thank you for being such a good friend personally, and to the film, and for all the amazing work and healing that you do. And as Steve said, for the opportunity to hang out. It's
absolutely. We are planning the webinar for your next book. No question.
And wonderful to see so many friends who showed up, and thank you all for watching the film and for participating.
Thank you. I love you so much, guys. And that's a lifelong, it's a generation. I love over 40, it's 45 years. Yesterday I was thinking, my God, what do you say about 45 years?
Thank you as well, by the way, for your help on being the humanities advisor to the film and doing one of the interviews with Yossi, one of the key interviews in the film.
Yeah, you remember at Yad Vashem.
Yad Vashem, of all places, yeah.
Yeah, that was an amazing moment. I remember it very well. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.
Yes.
I would like to just, before we say goodbye, I would like to inform the audience of our next webinars, our 3 upcoming webinars. Our next webinar on multi-generational legacies of torture will be held on June 27 in observance of the International Day of Support for Victims of Torture. On July 10, in advance of the day commemorating the genocide in Bosnia, our webinar's participants will be children of survivors of that genocide, including those born of rape. On August 9, the International Day of the World's Indigenous People, we will hold a webinar on the multi-generational legacies of the now infamous residential schools. As you see, our heart and minds are both curious to use Yossi's antidote to frozenness and minds that are only black or white, and that we really have to take very seriously. So both curiosity and open heart. And thank you, guys. So much love in all these international rooms. Take good care.
You too.